The first thing he noticed was the silence and uneasy calm, broken only by the hum of his Hellcat's engine as it cut across the morning sky. Far below, the Pacific stretched out like a sheet of cobalt glass. And then through the thin veil of distance and heat he saw them. Dozens of dark specks moving in tight formation, shimmering against the sunlight like a swarm of bees drifting toward the American fleet. In that moment, Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vraciu knew the day would demand more than instinct or courage. Something far larger was unfolding, something shaped not by individual heroes, but by years of preparation sacrifice in the invisible machinery of war. Just beyond the horizon, an entire nation's industrial heartbeat was pushing steel fuel and newly trained pilots into the Pacific faster than any enemy could destroy them. And facing them were young men from another nation, men asked to fight with barely enough flight hours to find their way home. What happens when two visions of warfare collide, one built on tradition, the other on mass training and industrial might? What does the sky look like when a generation's worth of pilots is thrown into a battle they were never prepared to survive? The path to that June morning did not begin with the roar of engines or the glint of sunlight on carrier decks. It began years earlier inside quiet classrooms and cramped training fields across Japan, where the Imperial Navy shaped its aviators with a philosophy rooted in an older world. Selection was brutal. Out of thousands of hopefuls, only a handful would ever touch the cockpit of a naval aircraft. Those who survived the process were refined over years 6, 7, sometimes 800 hours of flight time until formation flying became instinct and gunnery an extension of muscle memory. They were elite by design warriors forged for a single decisive battle their nation believed would end any future war before it truly began. But no training system built for peacetime could survive the reality that unfolded after 1941. When Midway sent 4 Japanese carriers to the bottom, it also took with them more than 100 of the Navy's finest aviators men, whose skill, experience, and judgment represented decades of investment. Their absence created a fracture in the training pipeline that Japan never repaired. Fuel shortages forced instructors to cut flight hours. Accidents became common. Students graduating in early 1944 might have 200 hours. By late 1944, some had fewer than 40. The gulf between the pilots Japan needed and the pilots it had was widening with every passing month. Across the ocean, the United States took a different path, one shaped not by exclusivity, but by scale. Even before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy had quietly expanded its pilot corps through a civilian training program designed to turn ordinary young men into competent aviators quickly and efficiently. When war came, training fields multiplied, flight lines lengthened, and instructors rotated back from combat to teach the next wave. By 1943, the United States was producing more than 20,000 naval aviators a year. Each pilot was not crafted into an elite duelist. They were molded into disciplined, reliable operators, able to fight within a vast, coordinated machine. The nation had built not just pilots, but a system that could replace them faster than combat could claim them. This contrast set the stage for the coming clash in the Marianas. When American forces landed on Saipan in mid-June 1944, they stepped onto ground that lay only 1,200 miles from Tokyo. From these islands, the new B-29 superfortresses could reach the Japanese home islands with full bomb loads. For Admiral Toyota, this was an existential threat. He declared that the fate of the empire would depend on the coming battle and ordered Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's first mobile fleet to strike. Ozawa sailed with 9 carriers and more than 400 aircraft, an impressive force on paper. But many of his pilots were barely trained, and the plan he carried, Operation Ego, rested on assumptions that no longer matched reality. He believed Japanese aviators still held the qualitative edge. He believed land-based aircraft from Guam and other fields would join the attack with precision. And he believed American carriers could be struck from long range before they could strike back. All of these beliefs would crumble when the first wave of aircraft lifted off on June 19th. The battle on June 19th began long before any pilot saw an enemy aircraft. Deep inside the carriers of Task Force 58 radar operators watched the glowing arc of a sweeping line trace across their screens. At 75 miles, the first Japanese strike appeared dozens of small echoes moving in loose formation. Within seconds, fighter directors aboard the USS Lexington and other carriers began issuing calm, clipped instructions. Course headings, altitudes, intercept points. The American response unfolded like an assembly line. Hellcats lifted from carrier decks, rolled into formation, and climbed toward the incoming wave. These pilots were not improvising. They were executing a system designed through years of training and refined by months of combat, one that turned radar information into lethal geometry. As the Japanese formation pressed forward, the disparity between the two air forces became unmistakable. Many of Ozawa's aviators were young men on their first combat mission. Their formation wavered as they approached altitudes, drifting spacing inconsistent. In contrast, more than 220 Hellcats moved with practiced precision, sinking from the sun or sweeping in from high angles to break apart the incoming groups before they could even begin their attack runs. The first clash was brutal and swift. American pilots later described it as effortless and unsettling word given the stakes. The Japanese fighters protecting the bombers turned into attacks instead of away, exposing their silhouettes. Torpedo bombers descended too early, losing altitude that they could never regain. Dive bombers attempted to tighten their formations only to become better targets. Many simply lacked the hours in the cockpit to sense danger behind them or recognize the cues of an incoming attack. Among the pilots sweeping into the fray was Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vraciu, flying from the USS Lexington. His supercharger malfunctioned, robbing his Hellcat of power at high altitude. Oil misted across his canopy, forcing him to wipe the glass repeatedly with a gloved hand. Yet, when he spotted the second Japanese wave, nearly 50 Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers, he rolled into a pursuit that would become legendary. The bombers below him held formation unaware or unable to react as Vraciu descended in a high-side attack. Every burst he fired was brief, deliberate, aimed precisely at the wing roots where fuel and structure converged. One bomber burst into flame and tumbled. Then another, and another. In 8 minutes, he destroyed 6 enemy aircraft using only 360 rounds, less than 5 seconds of total firing time. His efficiency was not showmanship, it was the product of a training lineage that traced back to Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, whose lessons Vraciu carried into combat. Across the sky, similar stories unfolded. Pilots achieved 2 3-5 kills in single sorties. Japanese formations dissolved under the weight of coordinated attacks and radar-guided vectors. By the time the first wave ended, more than 60% of the Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. Every successive wave fared worse. In those hours, the balance of the Pacific War shifted decisively. The confrontation was not a contest of equals, it was the collision of an air force built by industrial discipline against one weakened by attrition fuel shortages, and a training system collapsed under the pressure of modern war. Even as the air battle raged above the Philippine Sea, another struggle was unfolding beneath the waves, one that would deliver 2 of the most devastating blows the Japanese Navy would ever suffer. At 8:10 a.m., the submarine USS Albacore, operating dangerously close to Ozawa's carrier formation, seized a fleeting opportunity. With its fire control computer malfunctioning, Lieutenant Commander James Blanchard fired a spread of 6 torpedoes by eye-trusting instinct where instruments had failed. From the deck of the carrier, Taiho, Japan's newest and most heavily armored carrier, a young pilot named Sakio Komatsu had just launched when he spotted the white streak of a torpedo wake slicing through the water. In a split-second decision that reflected both courage and desperation, he dove his aircraft into the torpedo's path. The collision obliterated both torpedo and plane, but his sacrifice could not stop the others. One torpedo struck Taiho's starboard side, rupturing aviation fuel tanks deep below the hangar deck. At first, the damage seemed manageable. Taiho continued flight operations. But, unseen beneath the armored deck, gasoline vapor seeped through compartments and pooled in enclosed spaces. A poorly trained damage control officer attempting to disperse the fumes opened the ship's entire ventilation network, unwittingly pumping explosive vapor throughout the vessel. For hours, the concentration grew invisible and lethal until a spark no one knows from where triggered a massive internal detonation. Explosions ripped through Taiho from bow to stern, lifting sections of her armored deck. By mid-afternoon, she rolled and slipped beneath the waves, taking 1,660 men with her. Only hours later, another catastrophe struck. The submarine USS Kavala stalked the veteran carrier Shokaku, one of the few carriers still surviving from Pearl Harbor. Lieutenant Commander Herman Kostler maneuvered into a perfect firing position as Shokaku recovered aircraft. At just 1,200 yards, Kavala launched 6 torpedoes. 3 or 4 found their mark tearing into fuel stores and bomb magazines. Fire spread uncontrollably. A devastating explosion in the forward hangar ignited stored munitions, and within minutes, Shokaku stood on her bow, rising nearly vertical before sliding into the sea. Of her crew, 1,263 perished. By day's end, Japan had lost not only hundreds of aircraft, but also the irreplaceable expertise of thousands of sailors, armorers, mechanics, flight deck crews, radar operators, men whose years of practice and teamwork could not be replicated in months. Even the hulls of surviving carriers became hollow symbols. They lacked the trained air groups necessary to make them instruments of war. When the sun set on June 19th, the numbers told a brutal truth. Japan had launched 373 carrier aircraft in 4 waves. Only 130 returned. The United States lost 23. The kill ratio neared 11-1, a disparity so extreme that surviving Japanese pilots described the battle as hopeless. Most chilling of all was the psychological collapse that followed. Many Japanese aviators, confronted with the reality of their training deficit, realized they were being sent to die in battles they could not influence. It was in these ruins of morale and capability that Japan would eventually turn to kamikaze tactics, an admission that conventional naval aviation had ceased to exist. By the end of June, 19 Japanese carrier aviation was finished as an offensive force. The battle had lasted just a few hours. Its consequences would shape the rest of the Pacific War. The events over the Philippine Sea did more than destroy Japan's carrier air arm. They exposed the deeper fault lines between 2 visions of modern warfare. For decades, Japan had believed that elite skill forged through long and selective training could overcome material disadvantages. The United States believed the opposite, that in an industrial age, victory belonged to the nation that could build train coordinate and replace at a scale no warrior ethos could match. From the American perspective, June 19th validated their entire approach to the Pacific War. Task Force 58 did not succeed because every pilot was an exceptional marksman. It succeeded because every fighter squadron, every radar station, every submarine, and every ship operated within an integrated system where information flowed smoothly and replacements were always ready. Radar-directed fighter control, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire, reliable communications networks, and disciplined fuel management created an environment where average pilots could perform with extraordinary effect. To American strategists, the message was unmistakable. Industrial warfare had matured. Training pipelines mattered more than individual genius. Logistics mattered more than tradition. And a coordinated force, even without dramatic heroics, could systematically dismantle an opponent who lacked depth and infrastructure. Globally, military observers took note. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot became a case study in how not to wage modern war. Japan's emphasis on elite aviators had produced deadly results early in the conflict, but without robust training and replenishment systems, it became a fatal vulnerability. Nations watching from afar recognized that modern air power required factories, fuel instructors, intelligence networks, and doctrinal flexibility, not merely skilled pilots. For Japan, the psychological effect was profound. Surviving pilots and officers understood that no amount of bravery or sacrifice could reverse the training deficit. When Admiral Ozawa limped away with carriers intact but virtually no air groups left to fly from them, the illusion of Japan's carrier strength collapsed. From that moment on, Japanese naval aviation existed largely in name. For the United States, the aftermath strengthened a growing confidence in its ability to project power across the Pacific with near impunity. With Japanese air power gutted and its carrier force functionally neutralized the path toward the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and eventually Japan itself had opened. The world had witnessed more than a battle. It had seen the triumph of a strategic vision built on scale, discipline, and integration, one that would define naval warfare for generations. When the last echoes of gunfire faded over the Philippine Sea, the ocean looked deceptively calm. The wreckage of 2 carriers and hundreds of aircraft had already slipped beneath the waves, taking with them thousands of men whose stories ended in those silent depths. Yet above that still surface, the meaning of June 19th remained unmistakable. It was more than a victory. It was a revelation, a moment when the industrial age laid bare the limits of tradition, courage, and elite training. For Japan, the battle marked the point of no return. The carriers that had once spearheaded the attack on Pearl Harbor were now empty shells, unable to project meaningful air power. The pilots who had represented decades of skill and discipline were gone, replaced by young men who never received the hours, fuel, or mentorship they needed to survive. Their bravery was real. Their chances were not. The tragedy of the battle lies not in their willingness to fight, but in the failure of leadership that sent them into the sky unprepared. For the United States, the day confirmed something fundamental about modern warfare: that victory belongs to nations capable of organizing not only their armies, but their entire societies. The pilots who flew from Task Force 58 were not superhuman. They were the product of a system designed to ensure that every man who climbed into a cockpit, no matter his hometown or background, had the training, equipment, and support needed to prevail. The machinery of war extended far beyond the flight deck into factories, training squadrons, intelligence centers, and supply ships stretching across the Pacific. The photograph of Alexander Vraciu holding up 6 fingers captures the spirit of that moment. His grin was not triumph over the enemy. It was relief, gratitude, and the quiet knowledge that he had survived a day few could imagine. He always insisted the real story was not about aces, but about systems, about a nation that understood the demands of industrial war and rose to meet them. And so the question remains for us decades later: what lessons from the Philippine Sea still matter today? Do we remember the price of neglecting training? The danger of believing spirit alone can overcome material reality. The responsibility of leaders to prepare their nations for the wars they hope never to fight. If this story moves you, share your thoughts below. Which lesson from June 19th speaks most strongly to you? And if you value exploring the moments where history turned sometimes quietly, sometimes violently, consider joining us for the next chapter. The battle may be over, but the history is still being written.